The first time Selkie refused to walk past the harbor master's office, I should have listened harder. She stopped dead on the boardwalk, ears up, that clouded left eye catching the gray morning light, and gave a low sound in her chest I hadn't heard out of her since Fallujah. I told myself it was the gulls. I told myself a lot of things that first week back in Harbor Bend. My name's Dana Whitfield, and 3 months ago I would have told you I was done with towns like this one, small enough that everybody knows whose truck is parked where, and quiet enough that you can hear trouble coming from 2 streets away if you're paying attention. I'd spent 11 years learning to pay attention. Army did that to some people. The Marine Corps did it to me in a different way, slower, more patient, the kind of attention that comes from spending your whole career walking toward the thing everyone else is running from, one careful step at a time, waiting to see if today's the day it doesn't go your way. I came back because my Aunt Ruth had a stroke in the middle of ringing up a bait order and nobody found her for 6 hours. She won't say it like that. She says she took a little fall and that the shop got along fine without her for a spell. Ruth Whitfield has run the bait and tackle shop on Widow's Cove for 31 years, and pride is the last thing that stroke left untouched. Her right hand still doesn't close all the way around a coffee mug. She hides it by carrying 2 mugs at once, like that's just her way. The shop sits where the cove bends hard around a stand of dead pilings, close enough to the water that the whole building smells like salt and diesel and the particular sweetness of night crawlers in damp cedar shavings. Fog comes off the harbor most mornings thick enough that the lobster boats sound before their shapes, engines chugging out of gray nothing, gulls screaming over somebody's bait bucket. I'd forgotten how much of this town runs on sound before it runs on sight. Selkie walks it all with me now. She's a Belgian Malinois, 10 years old. Retired out of explosives detection after a training accident took most of the sight in her left eye, a valve failure on a pressure line, nobody's fault exactly, just one of those mornings where the equipment didn't hold. She still swings her head to compensate, still reads a room in about 4 seconds flat, still plants herself between me and a door before I've consciously registered there's a door worth watching. She wasn't a working dog to me for the last 2 years of her career. She was my partner. She's not a pet to me now, either. She's the reason I still do the door check window check thing before I let myself sit down in any room, including this one. Nobody in Harbor Bend needs to know why I do that. To the fishermen who come in for herring and line, I'm just Ruth's niece, the one who left for the service and came back quieter than she left. Good with a bait tank, better with the books, doesn't say much. That suits me. I didn't come home to be looked at. I came home to fix the register, fix the walk-in cooler, fix whatever needed fixing so Ruth could sit in her chair by the window and pretend she was only supervising, and then I planned on going back to whatever came next for me, someplace far enough away that nobody asked questions about the years in between. That was the plan for about 9 days. It started small enough that I almost let it go. Ruth flinching every time the bell over the door rang too fast. Ruth taking calls in the back room with the door shut, voice pitched low in a way she never used to bother with. A stack of mail she moved off the counter twice in one afternoon like she thought I hadn't noticed the first time. Then, on a Tuesday, a gray envelope came through the mail slot with a return address that read Coastal Compliance Partners, no other markings. The paper heavier than a bill has any business being. Ruth got to it before I did, moving faster than a woman recovering from a stroke should be able to move, folded it once, and slid it into the drawer under the register where she keeps the spare till and the shop's old marine radio. She smiled at me like nothing had happened. Told me a customer needed change for the crab pot machine out front. Selkie was already sitting by that drawer, ears forward, staring at it the way she used to stare at a car nobody else thought twice about. I didn't ask Ruth what was in the envelope. Not yet. But I made a note of where she kept it, the same way I used to make a note of which wire went where before I ever touched a single one. And I told myself that whatever this was, I was going to find out on my own time, in my own way. I should have asked her that same afternoon. I didn't know yet how little time we actually had. The mail slot rattled the next Thursday morning, but this time it wasn't an envelope. It was 3 men in navy windbreakers stamped with a seal I didn't recognize. Stepping through the door of the shop like they already owned it, The bell over the door hadn't even finished ringing when the lead one, mid-30s, clipboard tucked under one arm, a lanyard with a laminated badge that said Coastal Compliance Authority in block letters, told Ruth they were there to re-inspect the walk-in cooler and the bait tank filtration system. Said there'd been a complaint. Said it like it bored him to be there. I was behind the counter restocking hooks. Selkie was under the register where she always parked herself these days, chin on her paws, that clouded eye angled toward the door out of habit more than use. Something about the way all three men spread out instead of clustering together made the hair go up on the back of my neck before I'd registered a single wrong word out of any of them. Real inspectors don't fan out. Real inspectors don't have a guy hang back by the door with his hand resting easy inside his jacket like he's bored of holding something there. Real inspectors don't have a second one drift toward the register instead of the cooler he supposedly came to inspect. Mia Ferreira was at the counter that morning, picking up herring for her uncle's boat. 19 years old and built like she spent her summers on deck because she did. She froze halfway through counting out cash, eyes flicking to me like she was waiting for somebody older to tell her what was normal here. I didn't tell her anything. I just said, "Quiet, Mia, why don't you head to the back and check on the crab pots?" And she went, slow enough not to look like she was running, fast enough that I knew she'd understood something in my voice. The lead one, I'd learn his name soon enough, but in that moment he was just a clipboard and a bad haircut. Told Ruth she was 3 violations away from a shutdown order and there was a simpler way to handle all of it. A form. A voluntary surrender of her dock lease, effective immediately, compensation to follow through the county. All she had to do was sign. Ruth's bad hand curled tight around the counter edge. She told him no. Told him the shop had passed inspection in March, and she wanted a name and a supervisor's number before anybody touched her equipment. That's when the youngest one moved. He was maybe 25, all restless energy, jaw tight like he didn't want to be doing this and was doing it anyway. He came around the counter fast, reaching for the same drawer Ruth had slammed shut on me the week before, and Selkie was up and between him and that drawer before I'd finished setting down the box of hooks in my hand. She didn't growl first. She just planted herself, foursquare, blind side angled toward him without him knowing it mattered, and made herself an obstacle. He kicked her, not a stumble, not an accident, a clean, deliberate boot to her ribs that sent her sliding sideways into a shelf of sinkers. And for half a second the only sound in that shop was cans hitting the floor and Ruth screaming her name. I want to be honest about what happened in me right then, because it wasn't rage, not the loud kind. It went the other direction. Everything went slow and quiet and very, very clear, the way a room goes quiet right before you cut a wire you've already decided you're cutting. I checked Selkie with my eyes without moving my head. Ribs rising. Legs under her. Furious, not broken. Filed that away. The lead one had his hand still resting inside his jacket, badge swinging loose on its lanyard, standing 8 feet from me with his weight wrong, back foot flat instead of braced. The one by the door hadn't moved yet, watching the street more than watching me, which told me he was there for lookout. Not muscle. And the one who'd just put his boot into my dog was standing close enough that I could see the tremor in his hand, the kind that comes from a man who's angrier at himself than at anybody in the room. I set the box of hooks down without a sound. "You want to try that again," I said, "somewhere I can see your hands." He laughed, short and ugly, and told me to mind my own business unless I wanted the same. That was the last full sentence he got out before I moved. I didn't hit him first. I took his wrist, the one still twitching from adrenaline, and turned it the way you turn a wire you don't trust, until the joint had nowhere left to go but down, and he went down with it. More surprised than hurt. The lead one's hand came out of his jacket half a second too late. I had his forearm pinned to the counter before whatever he was reaching for cleared his pocket, and it turned out to be nothing worse than a phone. The one by the door finally moved, and Selkie, ribs and all, came off the floor and cut him off at the knees before he made it 3 steps, teeth closing on his sleeve with just enough pressure to make the point without breaking skin. Nobody fired a shot. Nobody needed to. It took less time than it takes to say it, and when it was done I had all 3 of them zip-tied with cable ties from the bait tackle rack, the same kind Ruth used to bundle rope, sitting against the counter while Ruth called it in with a hand that shook only a little. Mia came out from the back holding her phone like she'd already started filming and didn't know when to stop. She stared at me the way you stare at somebody you thought you knew. I knelt down next to Selkie, ran my hands along her ribs, tender, already starting to bruise, but every rib where it was supposed to be, and she pressed her head into my palm and let out a breath that sounded almost like relief. That's when the harbor patrol truck pulled into the lot, lights on, no siren, and a woman I hadn't seen in 6 years stepped out in a county uniform. Hand already on her radio, eyes sweeping the scene once before landing square on me. "Dana Whitfield," she said, like she was checking her own memory against what she was looking at. "I heard you were back in town." Her gaze moved to the 3 men zip-tied on the floor, then to Selkie, then back to me, and something in her face went carefully still. "Those aren't county inspectors," she said. "I've never seen those badges in my life." Castillo didn't wait for backup to keep asking questions. She had the fake badges bagged as evidence before the real county sheriff even rolled up, and by the time she'd walked the 3 men out to her truck one at a time, she'd already run their names through dispatch and come back with nothing, no compliance authority on record, no state contractor license, nothing tying them to any agency that existed. Whoever hired them built this from scratch, she said, standing in the doorway of the shop while Ruth swept up spilled sinkers with her good hand. "That takes money. And somebody who knows this town well enough to know your lease is the one worth taking." It took 4 days for the pattern to surface, and it surfaced because Castillo did the unglamorous work nobody puts in a headline, pulling inspection records for every dock lease renewed in the last 2 years, cross-referencing complaint numbers, looking for the same clumsy fingerprints. She found 6 other businesses along the harbor road with citations that didn't match their actual conditions. A smokehouse fined for refrigeration violations on equipment installed the year before. A tackle shop 2 docks down cited for structural issues an actual county inspector had cleared 18 months earlier. All the citations routed through the same private contractor code, one that traced back to a compliance consulting firm registered to an address that turned out to be a UPS mailbox in Bangor. I sat with that list at Ruth's kitchen table that night, Selkie's head heavy on my foot, and asked Ruth straight out who she thought wanted her lease badly enough to send 3 men through her front door. She didn't answer right away. She got up, poured herself coffee she wasn't going to drink, and told me a story I hadn't heard before, about a 19-year-old kid named Warren Doss who used to come into the shop 30 years back. Before he had 2 cannery buildings and a seat on every civic board in the county, back when he was just a deckhand trying to buy his first boat and every bank in 3 towns had turned him down. Ruth had co-signed that loan. Her late husband thought she was out of her mind. Warren Doss had paid every dollar back early, and for years afterward he'd send her a Christmas card and a case of good scotch her husband didn't drink, like the debt was still open even after it was closed. "He wouldn't do this," she said, in a voice that didn't sound as sure as the words. I didn't argue with her. I've learned that people don't stop believing in someone the moment the evidence shows up. They stop a long time after. Usually too late to matter. Warren Doss was harder to dislike than I wanted him to be. I watched him on the local news 2 nights later, standing at a podium in front of the harbor with the mayor and half the town council, talking about the state quota cuts coming down the pipe next spring. Real numbers, real bad news, boats sitting idle, families that had fished these waters for 4 generations about to lose the only work they'd ever known. He didn't sound like a man running a con. He sounded like a man carrying the whole harbor on his back, promising he had a plan, promising nobody was getting left behind on his watch, and the crowd behind him looked like they believed every word of it. That was the part that unsettled me more than any gray envelope could have. Cruelty I know how to read. This wasn't cruelty. This was a man who'd convinced an entire town, maybe convinced himself, that whatever he was doing it to save them. I didn't go near him. Going in loud gets you a lawsuit and a bad reputation and nothing you can use. So I did what I was trained to do with anything I didn't fully understand yet. I backed off, and I started building a picture instead, quietly, piece by piece, the way you map a device before you ever touch it. Castillo fed me what she could without risking her job. Mia started keeping a log of every unfamiliar face that came through the harbor asking questions about lease renewals. I spent 2 nights going through county property records at the library 2 towns over, where nobody would think to look for me, tracing every lease DOS's companies had picked up in the last 5 years. By the end of the week I had a shape to the thing. Even if I didn't have proof yet, a pattern of pressure moving down the harbor road one business at a time, always through paper before it ever showed up as men in a doorway. Then Castillo called me at 6 in the morning, her voice tighter than I'd heard it since the day of the raid, and told me the county had just posted an updated list of properties flagged for lease non-renewal pending compliance review. My name was on it. Ruth's shop, specifically, cited for violations that had never once been mentioned to us in writing until that morning. Castillo didn't waste time with sympathy. She told me to meet her at the shop in 20 minutes and to bring anything Ruth had kept from Coastal Compliance Partners, because whatever hit the county list that morning hadn't come from nowhere. Somebody had to file it. Ruth's hand shook when she finally pulled that gray envelope out of the drawer under the register, the one she'd hidden from me the first week I was back. Inside were 3 citations dated over the last 2 months, each one referencing an inspection nobody at the shop had ever witnessed. No inspector's name. No time of visit. Just violation codes and a signature block reading on behalf of the county that wasn't a county employee at all. Mia showed up before I'd finished reading them, out of breath, having heard from her uncle that half the harbor road was suddenly on some kind of watch list. She didn't ask if she could help. She just sat down at the counter, pulled out her phone, and started photographing every page, every date stamp, every inconsistency, the way somebody works when they've decided fear is a luxury they don't have time for anymore. It took us most of that day and half the next to build something real out of it. Mia had kept her promise from the week before, a running log of every unfamiliar face asking around the docks about leases, and 3 of those names lined up exactly with the fabricated inspection dates. Whoever was writing these citations wasn't even bothering to check who was actually working the harbor that day. Ruth had been marked present for a walk-in cooler violation on a Tuesday she'd spent at a cardiology follow-up 2 counties over. I had the discharge paperwork to prove it. Castillo took what we had straight to the county records office to file a formal challenge. The paper trail our only real leverage against 6 other businesses getting the same treatment. She told me the clerk on duty looked almost relieved to see somebody finally asking questions instead of just complying. That relief didn't last the night. Around 4 in the morning, my phone lit up with a call from Castillo. Her voice tightened a way I hadn't heard since the day of the raid. The county records annex, a squat brick building 2 blocks off Main that housed decades of permits, licenses, and inspection files, all of it still on paper because nobody had ever gotten around to digitizing a system nobody thought anyone would bother attacking, was on fire. I got there before the second truck did. Smoke was already rolling flat and thick over the harbor, catching the gray pre-dawn light in a way that made the whole street look underwater. Selkie was rigid beside me in the truck the entire drive, nose working overtime even with the windows up, and the second I opened the door she was out and moving toward the scene with a purpose I hadn't seen in her since her working days. She stopped hard at the edge of the parking lot, sat, and stared at a scorched gas can half melted against the curb, the kind of alert I'd seen 100 times in 100 worse places. Nobody official was paying attention to a 10-year-old dog with a clouded eye sitting at attention in a parking lot at 4 in the morning. I was, by the time the fire marshal's office got around to confirming what Selkie already knew, accelerant, deliberately placed, point of origin consistent with arson, the annex was a shell. Ruth's citations, the inspection records, every scrap of paper Castillo had pulled the day before, gone with everything else in that building. I stood in that parking lot with the smoke stinging my eyes and felt something close to the floor drop out from under me. The particular cold feeling of watching your only leverage burn down to nothing while you stand there with your hands empty. Whoever was behind this hadn't just been sending men through doorways. They were willing to torch a public records office to keep a case from ever being built. Mia found me an hour later, ash still drifting over the harbor, and asked the only question that mattered. What now? It took me the better part of that morning, sitting in Ruth's kitchen with cold coffee I wasn't drinking, before it came back to me, a detail from a maritime safety briefing years back, something about how any inspection tied to a federally licensed dock, even a small one, got logged not just locally but through a regional maritime compliance consortium that ran an independent digital record for insurance and federal grant purposes. Nobody thought about it because nobody ever needed it. County offices burned. Federal databases didn't. I called in a favor from an old logistics contact who still had access, gave her the dates and the business names, and told her I needed whatever she could pull without asking too many questions about why. It came back 2 days later, a plain email with an attachment that felt heavier than its file size had any right to be. Every citation issued against Ruth's shop, and 6 other businesses along the Harbor Road, had a matching digital record. And in that record, the originating account for every single filing traced back to the same private contractor code, registered under a shell entity with an address in Bangor. An address that, 3 clicks deeper, led straight back to a holding company quietly owned by Warren Doss. Warren Doss didn't come after me directly. That would have been too easy to see coming. 3 days after the compliance database confirmed what we already suspected, a segment ran on the regional news out of Portland, a friendly piece about the harbor's uncertain future, quota cuts, families facing the off-season without work. Doss sat for the interview looking exactly like a man who'd spent 30 years earning the town's trust, hands folded, voice steady, talking about hard choices and protecting the fleet. Near the end, almost as an afterthought, the reporter asked about concerns raised by a local veteran regarding recent compliance actions. Doss's face didn't change. That was the thing about him, he never looked cornered, even when he should have. He said he'd heard the rumors, said he understood readjustment to civilian life could be difficult for anyone who'd served, said he only hoped whoever was spreading these stories would find the support she needed. He never said my name. He didn't have to. Harbor Bend is small enough that everybody already knew exactly who he meant. By the next morning, the shop had 2 broken windows and a word spray-painted across the door that I won't repeat, and Ruth stood in the parking lot at 6 a.m. in her robe, staring at it with a stillness that scared me more than tears would have. I told her we should call it in. She told me she already had, and that the deputy who came out spent more time asking about my military discharge than about who'd thrown the rocks. That was the shape of the next week. Small, deniable things. A logged complaint about Selkie being a public safety risk after she growled at a stranger loitering by the bait tanks, a stranger who turned out to be Cole Doss, standing close enough to Ruth's register to make his point without ever touching anything. Customers who used to stop in twice a week suddenly finding reasons to drive the extra 10 minutes to the bigger bait shop past the county line. A woman at the grocery store who'd known Ruth for 20 years asking her, not unkindly, if she thought it was smart, keeping that dog and that soldier around the place. Mia took it harder than she let on. She still showed up every morning, still did her log, still helped where she could, but I noticed her checking the parking lot before she walked to her car, noticed her uncle picking her up instead of letting her walk the 4 blocks home like she used to. Then, on a gray Tuesday afternoon, Cole Doss found her alone behind the fish house, blocking the loading door just long enough to tell her that whatever she thought she knew about compliance filings, she didn't actually know anything, and that people who talked too much about things that weren't their business sometimes had trouble finding work on this harbor ever again. She didn't tell me for 2 days. When she finally did, sitting in Ruth's kitchen with her hands wrapped tight around a mug she wasn't drinking from, she asked me if this was the point where she was supposed to stop. I told her the truth, because she deserved that much. I told her I couldn't promise this ended clean, and that if she wanted out, nobody would think less of her for it. She looked at me for a long moment and said her uncle had lost his boat slip to a restructuring fee 2 years back that nobody could ever explain, and that she was done being the kind of person who just accepted things like that. I felt the weight of that more than I let show. I'd spent most of my career making sure the people around me came home whole. And here I was, watching a 19-year-old plant herself in front of the same kind of danger. Because I hadn't found a way to carry this alone, Ruth wouldn't hear any talk of backing off either. When I raised it, gently, once, she set down the mug in her weaker hand hard enough that coffee sloshed over the rim, and told me she'd spent 31 years building something in this town, And she wasn't going to spend what was left of her good years watching it get taken by a man she used to trust with her own money. The town meeting that Thursday told me exactly how far the damage had spread. I stood near the back with Selkie at my heel, and I watched people I'd known since I was a kid find reasons not to meet my eyes. Nobody said anything to my face. Nobody needed to. Doss stood at the front of the room getting handshakes and thanks for a proposed community stabilization fund, and I understood, watching it, that if this went to a vote on reputation alone, we had already lost. Castillo caught up with me in the parking lot afterward, her face lit orange under the sodium lights, and didn't waste time on comfort. The council moved the dock lease hearing up, she said. 8 days from now, not 8 weeks. Somebody on the inside wants this decided before you're ready. 8 days gave me barely enough time to do it right, so I didn't try to do it perfectly. I did it thoroughly instead. Castillo pulled every string she had to get the compliance backup entered as evidence ahead of the hearing instead of buried in a slow-moving fraud referral that might not surface for months. Mia spent those 8 days rebuilding her witness log into something a room full of strangers could follow in 5 minutes instead of 50. Ruth, against every piece of advice from her doctor and from me, insisted on being there in person, sitting in the front row where Warren Doss would have to look at her while it happened. The town hall was packed past its posted capacity that night, folding chairs lined up along the back wall, the smell of coffee and wet wool coats from an early cold snap moving in off the water. I sat near the front with a folder of printed records in front of me and Selkie lying at my feet, calm in the way she used to lie calm outside a door we were about to clear. Watching a room the way she'd once watched a street, Warren Doss sat at the front table with 2 members of the Harbor Commission, looking exactly like a man who expected to win. He nodded to people as they filed in. He shook hands. When the chairperson opened the floor for public comment on the dock lease renewals, he was the first to speak, and he spoke well. Quotas, the outside buyer offering a lifeline, the community fund he'd proposed, the sacrifices everybody would need to make together. It was the same speech I'd heard him give on the news, polished smooth from repetition, and I watched half the room nod along with it out of old habit and older trust. When my turn came, I didn't raise my voice. I laid the printed compliance records on the table in front of the commission one at a time, walked them through the dates, the missing inspector credentials, the citation codes that didn't correspond to any actual county inspection ever performed. I showed them Ruth's cardiology appointment on the same day she'd supposedly failed a walk-in cooler inspection at the shop. I showed them the other 6 businesses along the Harbor Road hit with the same pattern, the same contractor code, all of it routed through a shell entity registered in Bangor. Doss's attorney objected that the documents could have come from anywhere. That federal databases got things wrong too. I told the room I understood the concern, and then I asked Mia to come forward. She did, hands steady in a way I hadn't seen from her since the day of the raid, and laid out her log, every unfamiliar face she'd tracked near the docks over the past month, cross-referenced against the citation dates, cross-referenced again against county payroll records Castillo had pulled that showed none of those names had ever been employed by the county in any capacity. That was when Doss, sitting near the back where I hadn't clocked him until he stood up, made the mistake that ended it. He shouted that none of this proved anything, that Mia was a kid who didn't know what she was looking at. And in the heat of it he said something he couldn't take back, that he'd told the men doing the inspections to keep it clean, no rough stuff, and none of this was supposed to go past a few dented mailboxes. The room went dead quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when it hears something it can't unhear. Warren Doss turned toward his nephew with a look I only saw for a half second before he smoothed it away, but a half second was enough. Enough for the commission chair to ask Doss to repeat what he'd just said, on the record, under oath. Enough for 2 commission members to start looking at their own printed copies of the citations instead of at Warren Doss's face. He tried to recover it. He said his nephew was overwhelmed, said the boy didn't know what he was talking about, said the whole thing was being twisted by people with a personal grudge against a family that had done nothing but try to save this harbor. But the charm that had carried him through 30 years of civic goodwill didn't have anywhere left to land. I watched it happen in real time, the way you watch a structure lose its footing once the load-bearing piece gives, not a collapse all at once, but a slow, visible failure spreading outward from the point where it started. Castillo stood at the back of the room and made the call to the state's attorney's office right there, in front of everyone, and read off enough of what had just been said and shown that within the hour there were 2 more officers in the parking lot, waiting. The commission tabled the lease renewal vote that night rather than proceed under a cloud of active fraud allegations, which in practice meant every non-renewal notice tied to Doss's companies was frozen on the spot. Warren Doss was taken into custody 2 days later on state charges of fraud, coercion, and racketeering once the state's attorney's office finished cross-referencing the shell company records against 6 months of falsified filings. Cole Doss, facing his own charges, cooperated fully once he understood his uncle had no intention of protecting him. 6 weeks after that, the Harbor Commission voted to place every affected dock lease under a newly formed community trust, jointly held by the business owners themselves, immune to any single buyer or shell company ever consolidating them again. Every fabricated citation was voided. Every business that had paid fines under false pretenses received restitution from Doss's seized assets. Ruth kept the shop. She's back behind the counter most mornings now, bad hand and all, carrying 2 coffee mugs like she always has. I stayed on longer than I meant to. The harbor asked me to take on a safety officer position, checking docks and gear instead of clearing rooms, and I said yes before I'd fully decided to. I started a small rehoming program out of the back of the shop for retired working dogs like Selkie, matching them with people who understand what it means to take on a partner instead of a pet. Most mornings now, Selkie and I walk the length of the harbor road while the fog's still burning off the water, past storefronts that are still open, still lit, still standing, because enough people refuse to let them be taken quietly. She still swings her head to cover the blind side, still plants herself between me and anything she doesn't trust. I've stopped trying to talk her out of it. Some habits are worth keeping.